Hello, everyone. Welcome to the October Historic Ag Reserve Properties presentation. As always, we are joined with our host, Kenny Sholes, longtime Poolesville resident who enjoys exploring Ag Reserve history and serves as a board member for the Montgomery Countryside Alliance. Please remain muted during the presentation as there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. And if you feel more comfortable doing so, please also feel free to post any questions in the chat and we can read them for you. So Kenny, whenever you're ready, you can just go ahead.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so hopefully you all can see my slides here. What I thought I would talk about tonight is, we've spent, I'll go to the next slide because maybe illustrate a little bit better. So a lot of the discussions that we've had in the past have been focused on old homes, kind of, I don't know, in the western part of the Ag Reserve or south of Poolesville in the Seneca area. And so what I wanted to do was spend a little bit of time talking about some of the homes that are further north, kind of up along the Frederick County boundary line, still very much in the Ag Reserve, just to make sure that we're giving those homes attention. And what I would say about these is these are some really interesting homes. There's not as much historic record on many of them as I wish that there was. And so I think, I'm going to talk through them, but what I would also say is I really welcome anybody's input or any knowledge that you all have in any of these houses to help me better understand kind of their past. Please feel free to chime in either while I'm talking about them or at the end, because I think a lot of the records here are maybe not as comprehensive as I've seen at some of the other places. And that might just be the sources that I typically turn to are not as comprehensive in this area, but really, really kind of open the feedback here. So just to kind of orient you to this map, obviously we have the Frederick County line running kind of, diagonally across the center top of the screen. Got the Potomac River down the left-hand side. You can see Bellsville kind of in the center towards the bottom. And then up, where that big red circle for the Richard Hayes house is, that's Dickerson. So we are, again, really looking up kind of around, if where like the Monocacy Aqueduct is, kind of starting in that area and then moving out towards Comus and through Barnesville. So the first house that I wanted to talk about is Mount Ephraim. And it's a really interesting house. And I would say, first of all, what has been so awesome about this place is that there are relatively new owners as of the last couple of years, and they are absolutely wonderful. I've become good friends with them, and they are really dedicated to preserving the history of this home. And so that's really nice to know. And also they're, very open to sharing the property with me and letting me see it. And so I've been able to get inside this home, see it from top to bottom, walked around the property, and it's an absolutely beautiful place. So Mount Ephraim was built in 1868. It was built by Ephraim Harris. And I think this isn't coincidence, but what's funny about that is it literally sits at the intersection of Mount Ephraim Road and Harris Roads. And so Ephraim Harris built his house there, but what he actually had before he built the home was a mercantile shop right at that intersection. So he sold a bunch of goods. And then there's some records to indicate that he also had a restaurant at this spot, although when they did an inventory of this restaurant, it seemed like the only thing in there was whiskey. So a lot of people think that while they called it a restaurant, it was more of a bar or a saloon. And so he was a bit of an entrepreneur in this part of Dickerson. He, during the Civil War, before this home was built, where he had his store, he really capitalized on the movement of troops through this area. Mount Ephraim here, if you ever kind of go out to this home, kind of at the intersection of Mount Ephraim Road and Harris Roads, you are truly right at the base of Sugarloaf Mountain. And there was, as many of you who follow the Civil War know, there's a lot of troop movements around Sugarloaf Mountain, both given its, just key terrain, its position for signaling troops, and also just its movement of troops, north and south and east and west. And so what Ephraim Harris did was he made sure that he had goods ready to sell to troops moving through the area. I've even read accounts that he had some kind of like portable distilling machine or some kind of way to actually move alcohol to get it to different individuals in this area. And so he made quite a bit of money through this business. And after the Civil War, built his brick home here at Mount Ephraim. And it has kind of an interesting history. This is one of those houses that were really lucky because the Historic American Building Survey, when they sent their crews of young men through this area in the 1930s, they stopped by Mount Ephraim and took pictures. So you can see, I think it's the black and white ones here are the pictures that they took back in the 1930s. And honestly, not much has changed on this exterior. It looks pretty darn similar today as it did back then. If you're looking at kind of that center top picture, you'll kind of notice that in the center up top, there's what looks like a door, and it is a door. There was a porch at some point here. I've read that it was taken down in the 1940s when there was a big kind of refurbishment of the interior of this home. Although, again, I believe this picture in the center top was in the 30s, so it must have been taken down earlier than that. So the house, is somewhat federal in style, in architectural style, pretty symmetrical. Kind of, you see a lot of squares and blocks. But again, very, very common for farmhouses in these areas, kind of has that L-shaped back. And you can see that in that below center picture, you've got kind of this 2-story porch back there, which is very much still there, and allowed for sleeping in the summer when the conditions were too hot. The other thing that we have at the home that's still here is in the bottom right is what they believe was the summer kitchen. So, as many of you know, and I've talked about before, in a lot of these old houses in the 1800s, they would actually have the kitchen as a standalone facility so that if there was some kind of fire, it was not going to spread to the rest of the house. And so what you're looking at there is that kitchen. And what's kind of interesting here is that kitchen actually has a lower floor to it, because you can see it's kind of built on this hill. And so below it, there was a basement, which could have been some kind of cellar or something. Now, actually, livestock and goats come in and out below it, which is kind of interesting. And then the interior, it's a really beautiful interior. It was significantly kind of altered in the 1940s when they came in and did the refurbishment. But still definitely maintains a lot of kind of historic elements. You can see the staircase there very much looks historic and ties in with actually a lot of other staircases that I've seen throughout the Ag Reserve. The other interesting thing about this home is after the Harrises possessed this home, one of the owners, oddly enough, was the fencing coach for President Roosevelt. I don't know why. I guess he was big into fencing. And his coach, who was also involved in coaching Olympic teams, actually lived here for a period of time. And then following his, living in this home, there was an individual who was kind of a well-known author on preservation studies who lived in this house. And so it's kind of had some interesting history with its owners going back to when it was built in the 1860s. So this is the Lewis Sellman home, and we're going to talk about the Sellmans are going to come up a few times tonight from different houses. But this home is located in the Comus area. If you are driving past the Comus Inn, kind of leaving town, This house is a little bit down the road past Comus Inn on your right. The challenge is you cannot see it from the road. It sits way too far back. So I actually have never seen this house in person. I would absolutely love to, because I think it is a very, very unique style of home. It is somewhat federal in nature, but in terms of the architecture, but there are also some very clear Italianate features. You can see kind of with that relatively flat roof, and then kind of the cornices there connecting the walls to the roof are very, very similar to some other homes like Rocklands in the area, which are very much Italianate, and also built in the 1870 timeframe. So the Sellmans, relatively prosperous family in the Comus, Barnesville, Dickerson area throughout the 1800s, involved in a lot of farming and other businesses. And Louis Sellman, he received this property from his father, built this home. They think it was built in 1878. It's possible that there was another structure here before then, but we know for sure by 78 it was standing. Let's see here. Yeah, and so I like this picture. So this is, one of those shots from an airplane. I think this was taken in the 70s. And so you can see the house in the bottom right, and then you can kind of see the extent of the farmstead behind it. One of the things that the farm has, and I've seen it noted in a couple of different property records, is like an ice house. And if you look at the house here and then you go to the left a little bit, you can kind of see that little triangular shaped structure. It's kind of low level. I think that's what that is. A lot of times you see those, they're kind of very low to the ground because they are being fed by a well coming through with cool water, so you can store dairy and other foods that need to stay cold. So this is one of those homes that if anybody has any leads on this place, I would be all ears on it, because it's not exactly a place that I think is commonly talked about as part of kind of the historic infrastructure in the area, but I think it's quite an important home just from kind of an architectural standpoint. And obviously I don't have any pictures from the interior, and I would love to see kind of what that looks like. So again, with the Sellmans, this is Sellman Farm, or the Sellman farmhouse at least. And the Sellman farmhouse, for those of you, and I'm sure probably all of you, have been out to the Monocacy Aqueduct, that little road that you take to get out there to the aqueduct, it passes right by this farmhouse. You maybe you recognize it, maybe you don't. I would say the house, you see the picture here on the right, I think this was taken in the 80s or early 90s. It looks similar to this, but it's fallen on some bad times. So it's looking pretty rough right now. But the Sellman farm has been around since at least the 1820s. So this is certainly one of the older properties in the area. And I always think like one of the clues for that is when you look at the chimney there on the right, you can really see that initially it was kind of this stone chimney, and then they've built onto it as things have expanded. So this house maybe started as some kind of log structure, and then it was kind of added onto and then stuccoed over, just to kind of make it more durable to the elements. And the Sellmans owned this property as early as the late 1700s. And then they farmed it throughout most of the 1800s. It was a quite prosperous farm. It's located, again, very close to the Potomac River. So the soil is described as, being very fertile, and the crops having really strong yields. We know for a fact that enslaved persons worked on this farm. Steve says that truck is still parked there. Let me see. I gotta go back and check. That might be true. I'm gonna have to drive by there tomorrow and check that out, but you might be right. Yeah, it's a beautiful property. It's unfortunate that it's kind of fallen into disrepair, but so it was a large farmstead. I think it was something over 1,000 acres in the 1800s. And I know these pictures are kind of hard to kind of understand what you're looking at, but in the upper right, what you're seeing is two chimneys that were kind of on either side of a structure, and they are apparently kind of down in the woods below the home. And it's believed that this was actually the enslaved quarters. That's just clearly long been, neglected. And then on the left and in the bottom center was a stone barn. And I've talked about stone barns before. We don't have too many of them left, and so it's unfortunate that clearly we've kind of lost this one. I think if just given some of like the features I can see here, if it was fully constructed, it would look somewhat similar to that stone barn that we have out on Martinsburg Road. The barn that we're really trying to prevent getting into this positioning. But clearly, when you see these stone barns, that's a sign of some wealth. They didn't build these things at small little farmsteads. These were for your higher end working farms. And so while this farm has kind of become overgrown a little bit, my hope is that at some point in the future someone can kind of restore at least parts of it, because again, it is a pretty important farmstead, really interesting location, and really tied all the way back to the late 1700s with the Sellman family, which was, again, very common throughout the Dickerson, Comus, and Barnesville areas. This is the Alexander Pearre farm, and I think I talked about this one somewhat recently, I believe, with this group, but the Pearre family, they were French, as the name kind of implies, but they were one of the earlier settling families into this part of Montgomery. Well, it was then, I think, Frederick County, but now Montgomery County, in the early to mid 1700s. And Alexander Pearre built his farm out in the Comus area. And this is, you can see his farmhouse there. But again, just to kind of refresh your memory, the way that I came across this farm was looking at those aerial vintage photos from the airplanes and coming across this picture here on the right and seeing that cemetery down there. And then, figuring out what that cemetery was, but not really being sure what this home is, because that house and all of the structures around it are long gone. So unfortunately, the Pearre family farm here, built by Alexander, has been gone since, I believe, the early 70s. So what you're looking at on the left are pictures from the early 70s. So, I mean, at least we have that. We have some interior shots. We have some exterior shots to understand what this farmstead looked like. But unfortunately, this place is very much long gone. So much so that if you go to this cemetery now, which is kind of off on this little side street in a neighborhood at the base of Sugarloaf Mountain, you would be hard pressed to find any evidence that this whole farmstead was actually there at some point. Which is, I think, which is sad, and I think a reminder at just how quickly nature takes things back. And I've talked a lot here about the stories that we lose when homes go away, and I think this is a good example of, I think if the home was still with us, there would be a bit more of a record as to kind of its chain of custody, and the stories would come with it. But when these structures are demolished or just kind of fall into disrepair and fall over on themselves, a lot of that context is lost, which is unfortunate. So I'm glad that the cemetery is very much still there and still kept up, but I wish that this old home was still present with us. Now, a Pearre farm that we do still have with us is kind of not far from Alexander Pearre's farm. This is the James Pearre farm. James was, I believe, the son of Alexander, and was given property from his father. And it's interesting, I was looking at the records, and it says that he was given parts of two different tracts of land. One was called self-defense, and the other was called Italy. And I always am interested in how these tracts of land get these different names, and how they come up, but if you live in the Comus area and you're doing your taxes and you see on your property taxes on your plot of land, it says Italy or self-defense, it might be because you're still on the initial tract from the Pearre family back in the late 1700s and early 1800s. But James Pearre built this farm, we believe, right around 1860, so right at the outset of the Civil War. It doesn't look like he served in the Civil War. May have been too old and I might have missed it, or potentially too wealthy and didn't need to serve, because you can see that it is quite a grand home, pretty federal architectural in style, a lot of symmetry here. Very unique in that when you look at that upper left photo, we've got that double chimney effect. And I've talked about that before. That was kind of a stylistic choice that we've seen on a couple of homes in the Ag Reserve around this time period. So I think most notably would be the John Poole house. The next time you're sitting outside at Locals having a coffee, look at the side of John Poole and you'll notice that the two chimneys actually look quite similar, not as tall as these, but it's kind of this double chimney effect on the exterior of the home. So that was something that some builders of homes were doing. And then obviously, some of these big windows and stuff were added on later to the main block of the house. And just to get a sense of kind of, scale, this picture on the right, again, from our airplane photos with vintage aerial, you can really see the extent of the farmstead here. So it's the home, but there's also a historic barn, a bunch of outbuildings here in the trees. And then in the bottom left, you can kind of see, which we've seen in a lot of other houses, how while the main block of the home was probably built in 1860, over time, as needs of families and homeowners change, the home kind of grows and stretches with those needs, and so you can see that kind of growth stretching off the back of the main block there as more square footage was needed. Okay, so this is the Harris farmhouse. This is more moving towards the Barnesville area. Harris Farm is on Harris Road. If you know where the lavender farm is, I think it's Soleado lavender farm. This Harris farmhouse actually is right next to it. In fact, I think the two driveways go up next to each other and then they kind of diverge in two different directions. The Harris family is a long-standing family from the Barnesville area. They've been around these parts, kind of like the Pearres, since the late 1700s, and owned a lot of land. And one of the earlier structures that they built in the area along what is now Harris Road was kind of a log cabin structure that eventually kind of morphed into this farmhouse. And again, speaking of this expansion through time, you can kind of see on this farmhouse on the right side how that expansion has taken place over decades probably through the late 1800s. It's an interesting home from kind of a architectural standpoint, with kind of that double decked porch there, which is kind of unique. And then you can kind of see on the side clearly that initial chimney with the stone foundation part is kind of the old block of the house. And then again, like we were just looking at with the Pearre farm, as you go further to the back of the home, it looks like it likely gets newer and newer. There's interesting accounts from this property. So the Harris farmhouse, again, is one of those places that sits right at the base of Sugarloaf Mountain. And during the Civil War, my understanding is that Confederate troops were actually on this farm, on the land of this farm, doing some training and some drills in preparation for combat, and then were chased off the property by Union troops. So for those of you with ties to the Barnesville area, I know that there's been, at least in the past, some reenactments of some troop skirmishes that took place in Barnesville. My understanding is that there was some of that taking place here. And then there's some accounts that there were actually cannons that the Union placed on this land facing up towards Sugarloaf Mountain at one point, which was apparently a pretty big deal and of high interest to the children that were living at the farm at the time, just because of course it would be. You got cannons on your farm facing up on a mountain. And then deeper into Barnesville, and this is the Frederick Hayes house, which sits probably in Barnesville proper, or maybe just outside the town lines. This home built in the 1860s, but the Hayes family is somewhat of a well-known, long-established family in Barnesville. The Hayes family pretty early on, I think as early as the late 1700s, actually married into the Poole family. And so if you start tracing the family trees, you'll see a whole lot of overlap between the Hayes family and the Poole family. And in fact, my understanding from the records is that John Poole, the John Poole that we know of, who built the home in the middle of town, and who the town is named after, when he died, was actually buried on the Frederick Hayes farm. Now, I would caveat that by saying there's been a couple of Frederick Hayeses, and so I'm not convinced that it's necessarily this farm, but it certainly was in this area, and it very much could have been this location. But John Poole was apparently initially buried here and then reinterred to Monocacy Cemetery, where you can find his grave today. So this home, from the 1860s, I think there's a lot of kind of early Victorian influence here. I think this home looks pretty similar to some of the older homes from this time period that we actually see here in town and then in the immediate periphery of Poolesville. What is really interesting, and I would assume not original, is that bottom left picture with kind of that rear porch roof. I haven't seen anything like that anywhere else in the Ag Reserve. My guess is that was added on much later. I can't imagine that that's original. I haven't seen any design features like that anywhere else. And then again, just going to those aerial photos to the right to give you a sense of kind of the scope of the rest of the farmstead that was there. This is, I think, my favorite house that I'm going to talk about. And full disclosure, I know very little about it. So if anybody knows more than anything about this home, I would be all ears on it. But this is the Richard Hayes house. So again, the Hayes family. But this one is actually right in Dickerson. So this house is it's interesting because it's not far off the road, but it's hidden behind a whole lot of trees. And it's if you know where like the train overpass is right in Dickerson, instead of going under that overpass, if you turn left as if you were going out of town before you go over that, I think it's Dickerson Church Road. This house kind of sits back there and in a very, very quiet section kind of along the railroad. Richard Hayes built this home, you can see, in 1883. It's kind of declared in the records as federal in architectural style, and there is elements of that, but I actually think there's a lot of Italianate features here. You can see the curved windows, very pretty influential Italianate touch, and then just the way that the roof is kind of relatively flat. I haven't seen anything from the interior. I haven't seen anything from any other side of this home except from the front. So I'm very interested to see what the rest of the house looks like, and especially what the interior looks like. My understanding is that there's been a lot of changes on the interior, and I've seen records that say that the kitchen in this house started in the basement when it was first built, And since it was moved to the first floor, it's actually the kitchen has moved around, and at one point or another throughout this home's history, it has been in every single different room of the first floor, which is kind of funny to think about, a kitchen kind of changing locations within a home like that. But certainly an interesting house. Richard Hayes, as an individual, fought in the Civil War. He fought under the 35th Virginia Cavalry, which was known as the Comanches. That was Elijah White's unit from Poolesville. And I believe that Richard actually fought under the command of George Chiswell, who later built the Chiswell Farm, which we've talked about in the past. So he, from my understanding, when he returned from the war, was very outspoken in ensuring that Confederate veterans were honored and kind of lobbied for different monuments towards Confederate soldiers, and helped start the local chapter of the Daughters of the Confederacy in the area. So kind of an interesting past and tie into the Civil War through this house, even though it was built 20 or so years later after the Civil War commenced. Yeah, you can see, again, these are some shots. I think these are from the 60s or the 70s, but just kind of closer up. And I just think the details on this home are really interesting. I mean, clearly Richard Hayes spent a lot of, assuming he's the one that did, some of the design on this. There's a lot of just ornate little details that at most other homes are kind of just glossed over, and it seems like there was a lot of attention to detail here, which I just really appreciate. All right, so those were the homes I wanted to talk about, but I'm open to questions or comments or anything else.
Kenny, about the Hayes family, I know, isn't Lib Tolbert, she was a Hayes before she married a Tolbert, the late mayor of Barnesville.
Okay.
And I know, I think she might have been Richard Hayes's relative. I'm not positive.
That's possible. So I don't even know, Liz. Is she still with us?
She died several years ago, but she was the longtime mayor of Barnesville, quite a character. And I know she lived in one of the houses in Barnesville, obviously.
Right.
And she claims that Stonewall Jackson had dinner in her living room or her dining room during the Civil War. Obviously she wasn't alive then, but
yeah. That's interesting.
So I'm thinking it might have been Richard Hayes's family.
It could have been. Yeah, I mean, yeah, like I said, like the Hayes family in Barnesville, from what I can tell, was they seem to own a lot of the properties and a lot of the land in the area.
And they were longtime residents there.
Yeah,
obviously, very influential.
Okay, yeah, I'll try to trace that line back and see. That's interesting.
Yeah, but I know she was a Hayes.
Okay, it's good to know.
On that second Pearre farm, I think it was the James Pearre farm. Are there any of the outbuildings still standing, or is it just the house?
No, I think a lot of the outbuildings are still there. I get the sense that it's still very much a working farm. I haven't actually been out to that part. That's one of those ones that, I was saying this to a group the other day. I feel like all of kind of the low hanging fruit, so to speak, on old homes in the area, I've picked at this point, and now it's getting to homeowners that in some cases are difficult, but in a lot of cases are just harder to get in touch with. And so that's one of those houses where I'm trying to kind of figure out where that connection might be so that I can get out there. But I haven't quite gotten there yet. But my sense is, from looking at relatively recent stuff, that there's still a lot of that farmstead out there. And I think all of that Pearre family land, my understanding is it was put into some kind of trust so that it's largely protected from any kind of development, which is awesome. So
one of our participants has noted that Elizabeth Hayes Tolbert is the offspring of Frederick Hayes.
Okay. Okay.
That
Yeah.
gets
So that was okay. Yeah.
That
Makes
helps.
sense.
Thanks.
Yep.
Does anybody else have any other questions they want to unmute and ask them? No?
You guys are making it easy for me tonight.
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, I was just curious, like how you like approach the people that live in some of these houses. Do you just go up and knock, or
Yeah.
how do you go about finding information on these?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I am not brave enough to just do the thing where I show up and knock. I don't think I've done that yet. So most of the time what happens is I will post something on Facebook and somebody will send me a message and say like, hey, if you like this house, you should look at this house. My friend so-and-so is the owner. Here's his or her email. And I'll email them, and that's how it happens. And that has worked really, really well for the last few years. But like I was just saying, like I feel like those types of connections, I've kind of I've kind of extended everything I could there. And so now I am reaching that point where I may have to just get a little bit more bold and drive up to people's houses and knock on their doors. I don't want to do that. But yeah, so that's kind of the approach to the homeowners. And then and like the thing is, you can find, I mean, it's no secret to hear this. You can find out so much about like who owns a house just from a quick internet search. So Maryland maintains pretty extensive property records. So if you look up Maryland SDAT, SDAT, it will let you do property searches on different addresses. And so we have all the addresses of these old homes in just the records. And so I very frequently search those to see like who is the homeowner at this place. And then it's not hard to find somebody's email address from doing that. And so that has sometimes worked, but it's hard, it doesn't always work out. And so that's, I'm pressing. I have a couple of old homes that I really, really want to get to where I know who the homeowners are and they know who I am, and they're not super interested in having me come out, and that's fine too. But so I'm trying to kind of wear them down to show. I think it's not such an issue with me. I think some of our historic homeowners are just a little bit leery of sharing too much about their properties, and I fully respect that. I just I also think there's a balance between that and also sharing with the population some of the pieces of our collective history that are linked to your property, right? And so sometimes that balance is kind of hard to find.
Do you ever look on like Ancestry and like track family lines and see if there's any
a little bit? I'll tell you, I mean,
photos there?
Yeah, Glenn Wallace has been on here. Glenn has done the work that Glenn has done. I cannot overstate how critically important and groundbreaking it has been. And he's done it. I mean, he does the physical preservation work, which is amazing. But then he's cataloging everything on the Find a Grave website. And, if you go to Find a Grave and look at Monocacy Cemetery, you essentially can build your own family trees pretty quickly to figure out connections. And that is something that he has done kind of under the radar that I think is going to pay dividends for our community for decades to come, because as a result, it makes it so much easier to understand some of the interrelations in families in this area, and kind of when we're looking at old homes and different events, how those things tied together. So that is one of the places that I go to first. I also have an account with newspapers.com, which is really useful. So you can go back and look at newspapers from 1860s, 1870s around Poolesville and see search for different names and see kind of what was going on. There's a lot of obituaries in there that are useful, a lot of just news stories. So that's been really good. And then Maryland has, I think I've said this before on this to this group, but Maryland has a pretty good historic sites. It's called Maryland Medusa, and it's kind of like it's like a map that has an overlay of historic properties in the area, and that's a really, really great resource for looking into old properties. And what happened was in the 1970s, based on what I can tell from the records, they went around and did a ton of cataloging of old homes in the area. And so most of these old records of these old homes are from like 1973, 74. So I think that effort needs to be renewed a little bit by the county, just to kind of refresh some of these places, because all these pictures, which are great, they're from the 70s, so they're largely outdated in some cases. But that's been another really great resource that I turn to kind of find information about these places.
And Kenny, Glenn documented the whole Monocacy Cemetery, right?
Yeah. I mean, for those of you, I mean, I'm on the board, but Glenn is running that show. And for those of you who haven't been out to Monocacy Cemetery, I feel like it's one of those things that everybody in this area kind of knows about, but few have actually been out there too. It's really, if you're interested in local history, it's truly worth your time, especially this time of year. It's a beautiful historic cemetery. It is so much bigger than I think most people understand. It is a massive cemetery, and Glenn has mapped every square inch of that thing. And there's maps there that you can look at. There's guides. There's all kinds of resources. And if you want to kind of go down like rabbit holes about people that lived here on this land long before us, that is the place to do it. And I cannot recommend enough, if you have an afternoon off on a nice fall day, spending the time out at Monocacy is well worth your time.
Yeah, I pulled up the Find a Grave site for Monocacy. It's almost 6,000 memorials.
Yep.
That he captured, which is incredible.
It's amazing. And he's had people send like old yearbooks so that he can capture like yearbook photos from Poolesville High School in the 1950s, so that, you know, those are all cataloged to each individual. I mean, it's that work is just on an insane level of detail that I think people will come to understand how significant it is, but it's a big deal. It's made a huge difference. So there's a question here from Steve about what were the feelings of those who fought for the Confederacy and returned to Maryland and lived in this area? Were they tense? I don't know. It's a great question. I don't know the answer. I think about that a lot. I think about, you know, what would that have been like to go and fight for the Confederacy, you know, have the war end, and then kind of just come, in many cases around here, come back to your farm and get back into the fields. You know, what was that like? My guess would be that in these parts, because this area was so southern leaning, that there probably wasn't as much tension here as maybe there were in other places. So I don't know. I'm not sure, but it's an interesting thing to think about. But again, even though Maryland, you know, never officially seceded, this part of Maryland certainly was very southern leaning, and you know, the Union troops that were here and stationed here throughout the war speak pretty freely in letters about how the people in town aren't necessarily huge fans of them being present. And so I think returning from the war as a Confederate soldier, you know, my guess would be that the welcome they received here was probably pretty warm, if nothing else.
I had a great grandfather down in Southwest Virginia who he was in a Southern unit.
Mm-hmm.
One of his sons was in a Southern unit, but two of his sons fought for the Union. And after the war, the two sons who fought for the Union, they ended up leaving and moving out to Kansas. And I've always wondered and can only imagine, the personal strife within a family, and then the moves that people did make both during the war and because of the war.
Yeah, it's that's an interesting piece of, I think, American history that I mean, probably there's research out there on it, but I'd love to learn more about, because I think about that a lot too, as just as a West Point grad, and understanding kind of the history of that school and kind of who went south and who went north, and what that must have been like during the war, but then even after the war, about how do you repair those relationships, or do you,
Or do you? Yeah.
yeah, or do you? So yeah, it's a fascinating thing. I think there is, like, the more work on what the Ag Reserve was like in the 1870s would be really fascinating, because not only do you have that aspect of veterans returning to the area, but you also have the standing up of African American communities now that they are freed, but still very much working on these properties that they were enslaved on. So there's like some really interesting dynamics taking place that I think we could probably learn a lot about, but I think is kind of glossed over a little bit, because we jump from the Civil War to, the turn of the century pretty quickly.
Does anyone else have any questions? All right. Well, it's always, oh wait, there's a thank you. I'm new to Poolsville too, only a year.
Oh, welcome, Lori. It's good to have you.
Well, it's always great to have you here with us each month, taking the time to put together such awesome and informative presentations for us. So thank you so much for coming again. And if everybody else enjoyed, had a good experience tonight, please consider joining some of our other events. We have bridge and other board games every Tuesday from 1 to 4. We have a Zoom presentation with Larissa Johnson from Montgomery County's Residential Energy Program. She'll be discussing all things lighting. That's going to be on the 27th at 7. It's a Zoom presentation. And then also November 1st, we have John Long, who is a local beekeeper, coming out to talk about beekeeping in the Ag Reserve. So you can register for those on our website, which is poolsvilleseniors.org. And feel free to email any questions to info@poolsvilleseniors.org as well. And feel free to unmute and say goodbye to Kenny.
Thanks, Kenny. That was a good presentation. Enjoyed
Thank
it.
you, Kenny.
Excellent as always.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Night.
Mhm.
Good night.